all. My name is Russ Groves, the Department of Entomology, as Sherry mentioned. What I'm going to do is give you a bit of an insight on some of the work that we've been doing in the Central Sands, and it's coincidental. I'm talking to you from Hancock Ag Research Station today, or near to where a lot of the research that's been done that we'll report on today. Probably also one of the best ways to introduce me is to introduce the people in my lab. These are the 5 graduate students that are currently in the lab working on a variety of projects that you can see listed here. Probably Claire in the lower right is she is the newest person working in our laboratory working on neonicotinoid alternatives in vegetable crop systems. In terms of being germane to the topic area that we'll talk about today. If you Google neonics, this is often what you get. You'll get a fair amount of material that comes through the popular press that describes the relative impacts of these insecticides, and there's no question that the presence and prevalence of these insecticides have been having, unintended consequences. There's no question. But what are they even more specifically? These are a group of insecticides that when they were initially registered and developed in the 80s were identified as what we would call reduced risk alternatives to organophosphates and carbamates. They work on a specific synapse, they work on a specific neurotransmitter in a synapse, which we call the nicotinic acid receptor. We have some of those. Insects, of course, have them. These compounds work with far, far greater impact on those target sites in insects than they do on us. And so for that reason, that's why when these were initially registered, they had received, at least initially, such well reception as alternatives to compounds that we had existing. To this point right now, I would say, however, they are used so widely that they now comprise almost 30% of the entire pesticide use market, and that includes insecticides, fungicides, herbicides worldwide. So they are used extensively worldwide. With special reference to some of our work, and again, kind of indicating the value that they have brought, measured here in what we call an environmental impact quotient. If we go back to the period of 1990 or 94, and specifically looking at some of our work focusing on managing potato beetles here in the Central Sands, you can see that we had really high scores because we were using a lot of older chemistries. We were using carbamates, organophosphates. And when the neonics were initially registered in 95, you can see that those scores dramatically started to be reduced. So from an environmental, at least at the time, the thought was that the environmental impact was greatly reduced. Then over maybe the decade that followed, again, 2006 to maybe 2016, we started to see resistance or insensitivity. That, of course, was or is an issue that we need to deal with, but we have brought in newer, even reduced risk compounds, which very fortunately, again, has lowered our overall EIQ score in terms of the impact or the relative impact. The Central Sands, other parts of the state as well, but the Central Sands is an area where we grow a fairly significant amount of food that we find in the middle of the grocery store in cans or in the freezer. Long history of processing crops as well as potatoes grown here in the state. Some minor uses as well. And the figures on the far right just illustrate the fact that we do use neonics in several of these. In potatoes, mostly as at-plant materials, and then in sweet corn and snap beans with regularity also as seed treatments. But in other crops, we don't often use them. Probably onions, as far as other minor use crops, might be one of the instances or one of the areas where we might use these, but not anywhere near the kinds of uses that we would see in some other crops. If we, the Department of Ag, I would say this isn't new to the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Ag has been doing pesticide assessments for decades. And this is just a snapshot, in fact, of summaries that went on from for almost a 40-year period, starting in the 80s and then concluding around the 2020, where we are with regularity finding herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and then also nitrates associated with production agriculture generally. So again, the department is this is not new to this organization as far as testing and surveillance. For the neonics generally, their uses can, without question, be linked to most of the field and forage crop use in this country. I mean, if we look at this inset of 2003, 2006, and 2009, and these reports come from the USGS, and the USGS unfortunately doesn't even report on these data anymore. But you can see that over relatively short order, the magnitude of use of even just one of those neonics, thiamethoxam, had increased dramatically. And those increases were coincident with the use of a lot of the below ground genetically modified, the genetically modified traits in corn that were used below ground to target corn rootworm. And we see that they become commonplace. And now we're seeing that across many of the field and forage crop production regions. You know, the illustration here shows that corn and soybeans and wheat and cotton effectively comprise the lion's share of all of their uses. In Wisconsin here, those that are familiar with actually the area that I'm in right now, the Central Sands, it is known as the old glacial lake area. And that old glacial lake area basically is a sand bottom that we grow on. And water is very accessible and very available at shallow depths. And we can drop a high cap in and pull water up with relative ease and lower electricity bill than we often see in many other parts of the country. And so in part, that's why a lot of the specialty crop production has centered here in this region. But coincident with, that kind of texture or soil texture, water runs through those systems, even the water that we draw from for high capacity wells withdraws from these areas that become contaminated. And as I'll show you in just a moment, we can even see that a lot of the ditch network or streams that run through the Central Sands are recipient of a lot of the contaminants that we find below ground. This goes back, I mean, when the Department of Ag started initially detecting the neonics, which I think was around 2008, we were trying to learn about ways to identify treatments that would contribute less. We were looking at foliar uses, seed treatment uses, in-furrow uses, and we were looking at a very specific kind of delivery tool, which was an impregnation on like a small prill. The long and short of this was all of these different uses were contributing to the leachate that we saw below ground. And these two insets, A and B, refer to 2 years of a study. And interestingly enough, at the end of the production season, which is demarked by the dotted vertical line or vine killing, we would see the majority of the neonics run through that system and into below ground lysimeters that we had buried throughout the remaining half of the production year. So in a sand, whatever the pesticides you put in the ground, they run out of that ground relatively quickly. So our next step was to ask questions of whether or not these contaminants could be found within or among the many different irrigation or high capacity irrigation wells. And that shouldn't surprise anyone. Many of the wells that are put in the ground to extract water for a lot of these crops, unfortunately, do contain detectable levels of these neonics. We do see some clustering in terms of where we see some of the highs and lows. And those clusters in general are closer to what would be the upward portion of the drainage basin of many of these drains that go into the Wisconsin River. But again, in general, we see a lot, or I should say, a consistent amount of these neonics, and in this case, this is just one of those, thiamethoxam, in these wells. And then we moved to looking in the ditch water. And again, if for those that are on the call that are familiar with the central part of the state, you can see that we have, and they know that we have this continental divide. The streams in the blue sections are draining into the Wisconsin River. The streams in sort of the off green are draining into the Fox River drainage. So there is a continental divide here. And we do see a lot of specialty crop agriculture on the Wisconsin River drainage side, and it is in these regions that we find the greatest amount of contamination in a lot of the ditches and ditch water that runs through and bisects these irrigated sands. Again, it's not that we don't find these compounds in the Fox River drainage side. It's just that the frequency of occurrence and the concentrations are lower. So then we move to actually starting to look in the streams themselves and starting to determine where in the streams we would find these concentrations. And then ultimately we tried to model that and see where they were coming from. And we were focusing on a section of streams that we would call the Leola Ditch, the Leola Marsh, and also a ditch that we called Owens Rock. And then finally to the south, the Rocha Cree. These are streams that bisect this agriculturally intense area and then ultimately run into the Wisconsin River. And the little balloons here just indicate where we were sampling over multiple years to get an idea of what the stream detects were in the concentrations. And here are just a breakdown of 3 of the commonly used neonics: clothianidin, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam, from left to right. They're unfortunately frequently occurring. The dotted line demarks what we call the US EPA Aquatic Life Benchmark criteria. And that is above this aquatic life benchmark. That's where US EPA identifies a potential problem or hazard. And you can see that we have exceedances in every compound. We have far more exceedances with imidacloprid than we do really the other 2 compounds, thiamethoxam and clothianidin. If you were to just look specifically at clothianidin, you might know this as poncho or belay. These would be the trade names of those compounds, and you can see the proportion or number of exceedances that we found across, again, the Rocha Cree, the Leola Marsh, the Owens Rock, and Leola Ditch stream sections that you see on the left in this figure. For imidacloprid, you would know as Admire, Gaucho, or things like Leverage, Brigadier. Again, many exceedances with respect to aquatic life benchmarks across all of the stream systems, unfortunately. And then finally, thiamethoxam, the third, and probably the most commonly used neonic that we would see. We see a few exceedances. We certainly see detections. Just fortunately, we're below the aquatic life benchmarks for thiamethoxam in these regions, right? In general, also, we would find these exceedances highest, we'd find the highest concentration and exceedances in the upper portions of these drainage ditches. These drainage ditches, as they approach I-39, or the Continental Divide, otherwise known as the Johnstown Moraine, that's where you are closer to specialty crop agriculture or agriculture generally. As you get closer to the river and you get shallower to groundwater, it's more natural areas. And The same thing we would even see with nitrate. That's this illustration is just straight up an illustration of nitrate contaminants, and it stands to reason. Of course, it's in these agricultural streams where we also find the highest nitrate concentrations. And nitrate and the neonics are basically good regression partners in terms of their relationship in the landscape. So just in the last few minutes, I just want to illustrate some of the particle flow analysis that we did. This is an effort to ask the question, okay, if we measure something in a stream, where is it coming from? So here's an illustration in the star of one of these areas in a stream where we might measure. And the little hatching red dot area is what we would call the zone of contribution. So any water that would end up draining into that ditch in that star is going to come from the area, again, where the red cross-hatching or dotted area is present here on the map. And then what we do is we intersect that with what we call the cropland data layer. That is the overlying crop use pattern that anyone can access. If you just Google cropscape, you can find out what crops were grown, exactly where, and then you can overlay these things together. In the central sands, generally, in the area we sampled, here's an illustration of just the crops across all the different sample sites. It's a very busy graph, but it just shows you that things like deciduous forests and pasture are the most prevalent. And then we get into some of the crops like potatoes, sweet corn, beans, corn, and so forth. These are the overlying crops in these areas. So then what we can do is we can draw these contribution zones from really everywhere along a stream course, and we can look at it over times. The figure in the lower right shows you the time course in years, whether it's 1 year, 5 years, 10, or even 20 years. And you can see that it actually takes quite a bit of time for water to move into these streams below ground. And unfortunately, it takes quite a bit of time for any contaminants to leave these systems. And so if we just plot regressions against the different overlying crop use patterns, again, we see no relationship with neonic use and like the proportion of woody wetlands or deciduous forest or things like mixed forest. We don't use them there. And unfortunately, it's cultivated crops. So there's no question that our cropping systems are the ones that are really contributing, to all of these. We can break the cultivated crops down, and there's no question that the crops that I'd identified at the beginning, like potatoes and like some of our green beans, sweet corn, and even field corn and soybean are linked into these areas. So for the future, what can we do? A lot of the producer-led watershed group actions or activities, I think, are one of those solutions where people come together and prioritize what next steps might be in terms of recovering a water quality fraction in these areas. So again, people that have shared interests or shared use to think about ways to remediate these issues is also important. And why do we care? A lot of the health of an ecosystem does actually go all the way back to an insect. I suppose that's why an entomologist might be giving a talk like this, is because the invertebrates that live in these streams are affected if the aquatic life benchmarks are exceeded in many of these places. And from a human health standpoint, we're learning that even the exceedances of imidacloprid are having some of these effects. If you want to see a more comprehensive and contemporary view of some of these detections, don't hesitate. The Department of Ag just put out their 2024 report last year as far as groundwater contaminants. Unfortunately, clothianidin, imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, all three of these neonics are ones that we see being detected. And what's happening? Different states are doing different things. There is no formal federal action right now in terms of prohibiting the neonics in any way, but definitely different states are doing different things. Places like California, places like Colorado, New York, Washington, all illustrated here, are imposing their own restrictions on certain kinds of uses or use prohibitions in certain crops, to try to curb or limit the impact of the neonic presence. So that's what I have for you. I'm going to stop there, and I think what I'll do is I'll just remand the floor off to Sean.
That'd be great, Russ. While Dr. Conley gets set up, we are going to go ahead and launch a quick poll to collect some demographic information from our audience, from you. This anonymous information helps us evaluate the audiences we are reaching with this type of work, and we really appreciate you for filling out the polls as always. And just a heads up, there will be another poll/survey question at the end of the webinar that asks you about today's topic and future participation with on this topic. Answering these questions helps us improve future programs, so please take a moment to answer that when you do leave the webinar. Now that Sean Conley is set up, as soon as it looks like most of you have answered the poll, we will move on to Dr. Conley's presentation. Dr. Conley is the State Soybean and Small Grain Specialist with UW-Madison Extension. Go ahead and take it away, Sean.
All right. Well, good morning, Sherry. I guess it's afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Sean Conley, and I'm the State Soybean and Small Grain Specialist at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I'm going to be looking at this topic under the, the landscape of the major commodity row crops that we're dealing with here in Wisconsin, and really trying to impress upon the audience here, as well as others that will be viewing it later, is that there is obviously a role for our neonicotinoids. And I think as a agricultural community, there's places where these have a definite benefit for growers, and I kind of want to walk through these scenarios. So I'm going to start here with the the landscape of corn and soybean production systems across not just Wisconsin, but across the entire north central region here in the United States. And so if you can see here, all of these green colorations are corn acres that would have been planted in 2023. Soybean acres in 2023 would be more on the purple side. And again, these will be flipping again. So it will be very similar to this is what the plantable or planted landscape will look like in 2025. The point we want to really impress upon here is that neonicotinoids are on a lot of acres. And I think that Russ did a really good job talking about that. And if we look here on the corn side of things, roughly at least 99% of all corn acres that are not organic have a neonicotinoid seed treatment applied to them. So we're looking at somewhere in that 90 to 95 million acres on an annual basis. On the soybean side, it's a little harder to get a good handle on that. That number fluctuates, but I would, guesstimate that we're looking at 60 to 70% of all soybean acres in the north central region have that neonicotinoid on it. So roughly we're looking at in that 150 to 160 million acres. So that, I think that's part of the challenge we see here, is just how broadly these neonicotinoids are across the landscape, and how readily they're planted across the entire United States. Now, what I want to do is kind of walk through really quickly when and why neonicotinoid seed treatments are used. And I think I am not an entomologist, and I think my colleague, Dr. Russell Groves, will echo the statement that no, Sean is not an entomologist. But I think in terms from the agronomic side of things, why are farmers implementing these? These are the main reasons why. First of all, these seed treatments are usually applied where there is a documented history of pest problems. And on the soybean side of things, I think the biggest ones that we would see here, specifically in Wisconsin, would be targeted on the seed corn maggot. But then we also see some areas with wire room, and these would both go into the corn side of things. So again, where we see a documented history of pest problems are where we recommend that these seed treatments be applied. Next, we also see where I recommend these be applied, excuse me, in some of these high-risk cropping systems. So we're looking in manure systems, cover crop systems, transitional systems where we're maybe going from CRP or moving from some pasture land into more of a row crop production system, as well as continuous cropping. We see a lot of continuous corn grown in the state of Wisconsin for either corn silage production systems or others. So again, if you look at this list, a lot of these acres would check off in the state of Wisconsin. The other thing that we generally see here in Wisconsin, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is when we are recommending early planting, and we do see a physiological response. And I think farmers have noted that in the field when they're using a product, or specifically thiamethoxam, that has been measured and quantified, that there is a physiological response to that soybean plant, either having better emergence, quicker leaf area. So again, that is a common practice that we see as farmers can just see a difference visually out there when these neonicotinoids, specifically in this case for the physiological response, would be thiamethoxam. And then ultimately, what we've seen in the agricultural industry is we have fewer and fewer people in agriculture. We have a challenge with our workforce getting people to be able to go out there and be employed in agriculture. We're seeing the number of acres increase. So farmers are using neonicotinoids and other inputs as a risk mitigation strategy. Either this is targeted directly towards industry replant protection. What I mean by that is that if a farmer goes out and plants a soybean field after where they have that crop insurance date, many times a seed company will have an automatic or some percent reduction in replacing that seed if that seed has had a full seed treatment load, which would include a neonicotinoid seed treatment on it. So there are some reasons there where farmers are encouraged to use it to have that replant protection, as well as the whole idea, which we'll talk a little bit about, is overall farmer risk yield production. And farmers really looking at mitigating stress and financial impact, specifically if we're looking into going into 2025 like we are this year. So one of the roles that I work at here at UW-Madison is we run the variety testing program, and we plant research plots across the state of Wisconsin. We go from Spooner to Clinton, Wisconsin, Platteville to Seymour, and many points in between. And what that really allows me to do then is test not just the genetics, but also look at what's going on and what is applied to that soybean seed. Now, one of the questions that we usually do, and Dr. Damon Smith at University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as a team from the Division of Extension, is really push back and really try to encourage farmers to really understand what are they planting. And what I mean by that is you will order a specific seed. And let's just look here, and I will just pick on Don Mario because it's at the top of the list. And you order it, it comes in, and it has a full seed treatment load. And that full seed treatment load is Burris Power Shield. Well, my question to farmers is, what are you actually planting in terms of a seed treatment load? Is that just fungicide? Does that have biologicals? Does that have an insecticide on it? And the main point is I'm really trying to press upon farmers. It's really critical to understand if you're paying for an input, i.e. in this case, AC treatment, what are you actually applying out there? And what is that cost benefit ratio to you as a farmer? And it gets back to that whole question related about farmer risk and yield protection. So there was a tool NPM has developed called What's on Your Seed. And I would just like to encourage farmers. You can just go ahead and Google this, or maybe Sherry, we could send this out afterwards, a kind of a hot link to this, or what I'll do is I'll just drop it in the chat after I talk here. And what it allows you to do then is go through and figure out if I'm planting, let's say, this DynaShield, it says a metacloprid, you would know what that was, but Nitro Shield 4, okay? This would just tell you, by the name alone, it would not tell you what is on that seed. However, you look here, it tells you that, yes, there is a neonicotinoid on the seed treatment, and that would be a metacloprid. So again, just encourage farmers to really have a better sense of what they're applying out there and understand what that return on investment is for their specific farming operation. Now, one of the things that we've been doing and funded through the soybean checkoff program with both the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board as well as the North Central Soybean Research Program is this boots on the ground validation. And each one of these red dots across the north central region are basically farm fields where farmers gave us all of their data in terms of their planting intentions, their seed treatments, basically all of their agronomic information and their yield. We've been able then to collect data from over 8,000 farm fields and over 600,000 acres of data. And what this really allows us then to do is get beyond this question and this pushback that we get was that, well, Sean, you're just looking at our seed treatments from a small lens, a small scope, and really turn to look at this on a landscape scale. Are we seeing the efficacy of these neonicotinoids at a larger scale? So how you would read this figure right here is the higher up on this axis we have here, and the further to the right means that this agronomic management factor is more predictive of soybean yield. So we hear soybean planting data is a huge predictor of soybean yield. So what this then has allowed us then to do is go back into farmers and basically put forward a recommendation about what that yield loss penalty would be if or when you have delayed planting. So again, this is kind of some information we were able to glean from this work. And what this then has then allowed us to do is change our RMA replant coverage. So this has allowed us to go from across the state of Wisconsin, I believe it was 3 years ago, April 26th, with when we would have RMA replant coverage. Now, if we look in the southern third of the state, we've been able to gain 9 days, so farmers can plant as early as April 15th, which is 9 days earlier, and still get replant coverage if there is some type of frost event or a flooding event where we lose our soybean stand. So this is really important. And where this comes into play then is this whole idea of early planting and what role neonicotinoids play. One point that I always like to impress upon, farmers, CCA, and our clientele is yes, stand is important, but on the soybean side of things, we can lose roughly half to 2/3 of our stand and still be at that 95% yield potential or greater. So again, the point I'm making here is that yes, we have higher risk when we're planting earlier. We may have some higher risk for either pathogens or insects feeding in those situations. However, soybeans can suffer a pretty significant stand loss and still be close to 100% yield potential. Now, back to the question about neonicotinoids and specifically thiamethoxam in this issue related to what they've coined as their vigor effect is yes, we've been able to go out there and measure this increase in both SIPR, which would be basically photosynthetic leaf area, or cumulative NDVI, which basically would be coverage by applying thiamethoxam. And the target or the trade name we use here would be Cruiser Max in terms of the seed treatment we use. And yes, in our early planting systems, we do see a physiological response to using these neonicotinoids. We do see that as a potential reason why farmers are using these in the absence of potentially an insect pest or an insect threat, okay? Now, I've said this before, and I will kind of reiterate this, is that I'm probably the biggest flip-flopper out there in regarding to use of fungicide and insecticide seed treatments. Prior to this work that we're talking about here, I was pretty stanch and adamant that we should be looking at using neonicotinoids on every acre all the time. However, as we collected more data and we looked at the relative impact, not just here in Wisconsin, but across the entire region, in terms of the north central region, and even down here into the mid-south, we really want to look at, what is that yield response to our neonicotinoids. So roughly we got data from 194 trials across the country. We had looked at a little over 11,000 plot specific yields. And the short of it is that yes, neonicotinoids did give us a slightly greater yield than we did with either planting a fungicide seed treatment alone or an untreated check. However, when we looked at that return on investment, we're based on different commodity feed prices, different seeding rates. We notice here across many of these that return on investment is pretty much break even at best. So And with some instances where we did see a positive yield response or economic response to a fungicide insecticide seed treatment. But I guess the point we're really making here is that in general, across the country, we did not see a huge, always positive yield response from the prophylactic use of these neonicotinoid seed treatments. And I'm not here going to say that they don't have efficacy and they don't work. However, they're going to work in an area where there's an insect pest that it's targeted against. All right. Now, back to this question or this whole data from these larger farm fields. We have lots of farm fields, over 8,000 fields. We have over 600,000 acres of data. And in short, we found seed treatments, the use of seed treatments pretty low on the list in terms of what actually predicts soybean yield. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. And frankly, when we looked at these farm level, farm field scales, we see that the use of fungicide alone gave us roughly 0.25 bushels per acre. And then the use of an insecticide seed treatment, which would have been paired with the fungicide, was 0.3 bushels per acre. So again, depending on what that would be, at best, that would be a break-even opportunity. And just depending on what that price was at that farm gate level, maybe it would be a net loss. So again, just wanted to kind of show what this large plot farmer grower driven data looks like across the country. Okay. Last thing I really want to talk about then is this whole idea of risk. We did some work here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This information is on my webpage, which is www.coolbean.info, looking at risk. And for the purposes of this, we're just going to talk about using a relatively low input system where, we didn't really put a lot of foliar feed. We didn't use a foliar fungicide, insecticide. We didn't use any seed treatments compared to what we consider the kitchen sink trial, where we basically threw everything at the kitchen sink. And intuitively, and I think this is what is sold and marketed to farmers, is the more input you throw at a field setting, and in this case, soybean, it should minimize that risk to that farmer. Okay. And in short, what we found was there was really no risk difference between going really at a base bare minimum input system. You control the weeds, you keep the fertility level where they should be, versus going kitchen sink. So I think this really dispels that whole idea that throwing everything at that crop, in this case soybeans, minimizes risk. And if you want more detail of this, feel free to read it. We looked at this whole idea of risk at many different caveats, characteristics. All right. The last thing I want to really talk about is looking at what we've seen is a pretty significant increase of using cover crops in soybean production systems. And we're doing this to build soil health. We're doing this to decrease some of the challenges we have with water quality. That's why Sherry and the water quality team, invited Russ and I to come here and speak to this point. And one of the things that we have seen, and this has been reported in literature, is that in these cover crop systems, we tend to see slug damage increasing. And a lot of that has to be driven by the fact that some of the predatory insects that have activity or are working on slugs are getting a secondary effect or dose of this neonicotinoid, and decreases the efficacy of these biological agents against slugs. So in a sense, what we're seeing is, we tell farmers to use something like a neonicotinoid in an environment where we might use cover crops, initially was a recommendation. However, now we're seeing the reports come out that we actually maybe are enhancing slug damage, enhancing the amount of slugs that we see in these cover crop and no-till systems. So with that being said, I want to make sure we have enough time to have questions. So feel free to go to my website, which is coolbean.info, or you can follow me on X, which is at Badgerbean. And with that, I will stop sharing my slides and I will defer to Sherry and the panel.
Hi again. Thank you so much, Sean and Russ, for your really excellent presentations. Yes, we have time for questions, and we have some excellent questions in the Q&A. If you're the audience, you have a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A box, or even just look at them and upvote your favorite questions to make sure those ones get asked. Okay, to start with, so we had a question, I believe directed towards Russ. Someone had a question about if turf grass or ornamental applications of neonics are contributing to neonic contamination of waterways, or do we know if the vast majority of neonic contamination is coming from agriculture?
Yeah, it's a good question. We do know that a lot of the professional products that are sold to homeowners are definitely also contributing. In fact, many of the state label changes like that we concluded with in as far as laws in different states, some of those are prohibiting uses for their availability in places like Jung's or Home Depot or any of the big box stores. And that is because homeowners, have access to these compounds and they get used very regularly. And a lot of these end up definitely in the sanitary sewer, and the sanitary sewer ends up being moved, outside into natural environment. So that unquestionably happens. Everything that I reported on, focuses here in agriculture specifically. So, but that's a study. I mean, those kinds of observations are very well known and very relevant. And unfortunately, yes, happen all the time.
Thank you. I think a semi-related question is what regulations, and this is for Sean or Russ, what regulations are in effect in Wisconsin related to the use of neonicotinoids?
Well, I'll answer really quick and then Sean can add his. In Wisconsin, the regulations are basically what's on the label. And so there are no further restrictions beyond those on the published labels or prohibitions in terms of any revisions in crop groupings. We do anticipate all pesticides get reevaluated or re-registered about every 12 to 15 years. The neonics were up for re-registration in about 2018. And because of all of the issues with the neonics, not only the impacts on non-target organisms, but also off-site movement and contamination, and now with the renewal of the Endangered Species Act, those haven't finished, those have not concluded yet. And we anticipate that there could be some significant federal revisions for certain crop groupings or use pattern, et cetera. So, but nothing yet as far as a revision in the state.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. And the only other thing I'd like to add to that, there are some public lands that there are some limitations, such as DNR land. I do know that if a farmer is renting land to crop, that there may be some restrictions for using some of these neonicotinoids in those settings, but that is just beyond that. I don't really have anything off the top of my head to add to what Russ said.
Great. Well, while I've got you then, Sean, I think this question is maybe directed towards you. What is the availability of non-treated seed?
Russ can and will correct me when I'm wrong here as I state things. So I think on the corn side of things, to be honest and frank, it's very difficult to get corn hybrid seed that does not have a neonicotinoid on it, unless you're buying either a organic seed. To the best of my knowledge, is very challenging. And if you are looking to do that, you would usually have to make that request 9 months to a year ahead of time to even get access to that seed, if you can. And you may be limited then in the genetics and hybrids that you have access to. So that's in the corn side of things. The soybean side of things, usually that seed treatment is done downstream further. It's not done it's done more locally. But then even those decisions have to be made usually at the point of purchase, which could be August, September of the year before is when those decisions need to be made. And again, one of the challenges that they come into play then is if you choose not to use, for whatever reason, an insecticide, then you are out of a lot of these automatic replant programs that the seed company may have. So there are some choices there that farmers need to make, but it's easier to opt out, if you will, of soybean than it is for corn. Russ, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, that's all correct in my mind. And as far as the smaller, like market, commodities like, in our seed catalogs and stuff like that for specialty crops, you can easily get materials that, aren't treated. And in many cases, they don't come treated with a neonic. If you wanted onions, if you were a commercial grower and you wanted onions treated, or if you wanted green beans treated, you would actually have to go to a third party for those kinds of treatments, much like Sean was saying, maybe to some extent with some soybean. But by and large, if you're ordering from the seed catalogs, unless they expressly state it, they do not come pre-treated. And I guess I would also add, just make sure and look at the label very carefully, because there are many fungicides that are treated on seeded crops, and it doesn't necessarily mean that an insecticide is part of that package. But it's not easy because these names are challenging and difficult to follow. But it is important to look carefully and see, what specifically is on the seed as far as a treatment.
Yeah, and to that end, Sean, as you requested, we did put a link in the chat so the audience knows to that NPM resource of what's on my seed. And I think, Sean, there's also a resource on there that sort of shows you how to read a label on the back of a packet. So just some really helpful resources there, audience. If you have the ability to check that out, go for it. Okay, we have a few more minute to as many as we can. There was a question, I believe this was during Russ's presentation. Were the samples and the data connected for some of the numbers that you shared connected to the 9 key element plan for the 14 Mile Creek watershed at all?
There's certainly supplementary. I mean, we know of the 9 key element plan that's going on. In fact, there's a few other different people from UW-Stevens Point that are sampling even in these same areas, just because it's an ecologically sensitive area, shallow to groundwater, sandy soils, and so many people are working in these areas. They are definitely shared and made available. Probably the route of sharing, or at least the common route of sharing, is through the Department of Ag. So DATCAP has partially supported our work over the last, well, at least a lot of the stream assessment work. And so all of those in final reports are made available, and those are made available back to cooperators like those that are participating in the 9 key element plan. So it's a good question.
I think, yeah, so maybe this would be a good question for Sean, but of course, either one of you can jump in. So if Sean, you shared numbers that showed there's potentially no net gain in using an insecticide or fungicide, how fast does this info change, or maybe could this info change a farmer's usage of them, and how does this info get shared with the farmer?
Sure.
Complicated question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think this is really gets to kind of the heart of the question in terms of having access to seed that doesn't have a seed treatment applied to it. I think that's the biggest challenge that farmers run into. And we've been communicating this data for, my change, if you will, of my flip-flop occurred roughly in 2019, 2020. So we've had 5 years of talking about this. And I think what we've really seen here is that we have some farmers moving away from it. I think farmers are trying it on their own farm, looking to see if there is a difference. And some farmers have moved away from it. Others still utilize it as an effective tool. Obviously there are locations like in the Mid-South, the South, where they have different insect species and populations that are effective. They have thrips that is pretty effective against. We don't have those up here. We don't really have soybean aphids. We've done a good job of battling those. We do have seed corn maggot, which can be a challenge for our farmers, specifically with manure systems that we have in Wisconsin. So I think it's something that, farmers need to try and look at on their own. At least they have more access on the soybean side of things. I mean, on the corn side of things, they either have to talk to their seed person, or they're just, frankly, stuck. I mean, there's really not a lot of choices they have, which is, I can understand the logistics behind why a seed company does what they do, but again, I think if we just look at the data, I think this is farmers specifically. From my mind, farmers need to push back. If they don't feel like they're seeing efficacy, has to be a farmer ground driven pushback to industry. That's my perspective. Russ, comments, thoughts?
No, that's true. It's all true. But there'll be some headwinds, as Sean was saying. There's a lot of logistics and about, pre-treatment and making seed available and, destination delivery, et cetera. So, it's a challenge. And add to that, if we rewind 15 years ago, many of the major seed companies have been acquired by some of the major chemical companies. And so what we see are packages that are, out in the marketplace. So it's hard to disentangle these things for sure.
Great answers for a complex question, for sure. I have one more. I think it's kind of a quick question because I think you sort of covered it, Russ, but have you done any sampling for the movement of neonics in more clay soils?
Yeah, I mean, we have not. There's no question that that other people have, unfortunately, and I'm seeing in the in the Q&A, someone wrote about like other wetland areas, like lakes and et cetera. Unfortunately, there's a large body of work that has gone on over the country over the last decade, and it's unfortunate. We find neonics everywhere. We find them in almost all water bodies, surface water bodies, streams and rivers, and we find them in different soil types. To the person's question, maybe about an old prairie soil that has got more of a clay layer or has a higher clay fraction. There's no question that the pattern of movement is a little bit different. The time frame over which they move through that soil is different. Those soils have higher, what we call exchange capacity. They will bind up those insecticides and they won't release them and move them as quickly. But the compounds are still there, and they still are water soluble, and they will still move through those environments. There's no question. The timing is just a bit different.
Yeah, great. Well, that is all the time we have for Q&A. Thank you again to Sean and Russ for speaking today. We really appreciate it. And to our audience, if you are in need of a CCA credit for sitting through this webinar, that is being shared on the screen as of right now. If you're unable to use the QR code to get that credit, go ahead and put your name and your CCA number in the chat. And also, as you can see, the end of webinar poll has been launched. Thank you to everyone who responds to that. We really appreciate your insight so that we can continue creating our Ag Water Quality Winter Webinar Series and making it useful and interesting to all of you. Thank you for spending your time with us, and thanks for the great questions. We invite you to visit the Agriculture Water Quality Program website for other content on this topic and others. The recording, just a reminder, the recording for all webinars in this series will be uploaded to YouTube and linked on our topic hub as well. We appreciate your time today and would love to have you back in 1 week to hear about extreme weather and conservation practices that can improve water quality and flood prevention. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks for participating.